Tom Pelissero, NFL Network insider. He's been busy. You can, by the way, you can see the Dolphins Chiefs Saturday at 8 Eastern exclusively on Peacock as we make way for Tom. All right, let's start with Belichick here. He does want to coach. Where do you think is the best fit for Bill Belichick?
I would tell you this, Dan, with Bill Belichick, he's been aware for months that potentially things would be coming to an end in New England. And so without, making a lot of direct contact teams, he's back channeled things and gotten a pretty good understanding of, what potentially his options might be. I would tell you there's been a lot of discussion about the Atlanta Falcons. I would say that is one possibility. But there are also possibilities that there are teams that maybe are still in the playoffs, teams that do employ head coaches, maybe teams that weren't thinking about making a change, but for the availability of arguably the greatest coach in NFL history suddenly coming to the forefront here. In other words, if you're any team that feels like, we've got a good coach, but we may not have a great coach, why would you not have a conversation right now about Bill Belichick? There's delicate pieces of this. There are rules regarding interview processes and whatnot. I think that for Bill Belichick, it always made sense, even though we're going to get a press conference today and this has been finalized, Bill Belichick and the Patriots are parting ways. It has always made sense for Bill Belichick to wait and see what happens in the first, maybe even the second round of the playoffs, and see maybe where there's some other teams that are a little further along that may not be as much of a build for him that might end up potentially becoming options.
Okay. Are we hinting at the Cowboys here, Tom?
We're hinting at any team that might believe after you get into the playoffs here that maybe you could upgrade of going to Bill Belichick. Listen, it's got to be a pretty specific type of team, right? And that's on multiple fronts. Bill Belichick is not going to take over a total rebuild. He's 72 years old. As much as he's done that in a place like New England, that was a quarter century ago. Bill Belichick is not sitting there going, all right, I got 5 years to build something elsewhere. If he's going to go, he's got to think, we've got enough pieces on the roster that I can get this thing rolling and get it rolling quickly. It's also got to be the right ownership, the right structure. If you've got a team that has a hyper-involved owner, or you've got a team that is going to put in place layers of other people above Bill, people that can tell Bill how to do his job, that's not really going to be a fit for him either. For instance, I know that there's been a lot of rumors and speculation about the Washington Commanders. I do not see that being a fit for Bill Belichick for all the reasons I just mentioned. They're going to hire a president of football operations. They do have a little bit further to go on the roster, even though they got a lot of capital to do it. A place like Atlanta that's got a much improved defense, that's invested on that side of the ball, that does have players at the skill spots. They still need a quarterback. That's a lot further along here. And again, there's some places right now that have head coaches in place that maybe based upon upcoming results or maybe how the season ended, might be willing to make a change, but only if they can get a guy like a Bill Belichick and take your shot for the next 2-3 years, whatever that timeline might be.
What did the Patriots do?
The Patriots, I would anticipate running a very targeted search. They're not going to just, put out 10, 12 requests for all these different people. They're going to start by looking within the family. So who is that? You got Gerard Mayo, who's an in-house option on the coaching staff. I would certainly not say that by any stretch that's a slam dunk that Gerard Mayo gets that job. There's other coaches out there, Mike Vrabel being chief among them. I mean, a couple of months ago, he's sitting in Robert Kraft's suite and saying, we got a game to win today, and maybe taking a veiled shot at his current employer at the time by saying, hey, fans, enjoy this because it's not like this everywhere. Mike Vrabel has a long history in that organization, including being a player there. It certainly is a consideration. So would be a Brian Flores, who's now the Vikings defensive coordinator. He won a Super Bowl with Bill Belichick as the DC in New England. I think that you're going to look at all those types of guys because they know how that building functions. Dan, New England is not like any place else because of the unilateral power that Bill Belichick has had for so long in that building. They're going to need a general manager too. They're going to need to build out their operational staff. They're going to need to build out a lot of different things because there's nobody, even the guys who have been there before, that are going to take on as much as Bill Belichick did. And I think that when you trace through why ultimately here Bill Belichick and Robert Kraft are going separate directions, it's not simply 4-13 this season. It's about how certain things have eroded over the course of time in New England. When you look at their coaching staff, when you look at the front office staff, they've got good people on both fronts, but it's not the same people. Look at how many people have gotten head coaching jobs or GM jobs and have left. How, the basically a brain drain that they've had over the course of time here. There were a lot of discussions among Bill Belichick and Robert Kraft, especially on Monday. They met for hours on that day, talked through every scenario, including scenarios where Bill Belichick would come back. But Belichick said it himself when he met with reporters Monday morning, we got to get some things fixed. Robert Kraft had his ideas of how you're going to fix that. Bill Belichick had his own ideas on how to fix that. You have seen an erosion of Bill Belichick's authority to a certain degree in recent years. For instance, last year when Robert Kraft put out a rare press release saying, hey, we're going to keep Gerard Mayo. We're bringing in Bill O'Brien as the offensive coordinator. New England has never done things like that. And so for Belichick, he was going to want to make certain changes in terms of the people as much as anything. So was Robert Kraft. They weren't quite on the same page. Everybody's going to go their own directions.
Tom Pelissero, NFL Network insider. Jim Harbaugh, how close do you think this is to a real possibility that he goes to the NFL?
I believe it's a real possibility, Dan, and I believe it's been a real possibility in Jim Harbaugh's mind for a couple of years now. You trace it back to 2 years ago when he interviewed in person with the Vikings on National Signing Day. That's how serious Jim Harbaugh was about the possibility of going to the NFL. And was that partly to tweak an administration that had just forced him to take a pay cut the year before coming off COVID? Who's to say? But he was very serious about that job to the point that he did a Zoom with the Vikings and then went in person and did I want to say it was a 7-hour interview with them. They ultimately, based on the results of the interviews, as well as just kind of the fit, they decided to go with Kevin O'Connell. That's been a really good hire for them. Last year with Denver, Harbaugh did a Zoom with the Broncos. They wanted to get him in for an in-person interview. And this is not a direct quote from Harbaugh, but the sense on his end was, I'm Jim Harbaugh. How many interviews do I have to do? You know exactly who I am as a coach. Just hire me if you want to. The Penners actually flew and visited Harbaugh in Ann Arbor to try to get him to reconsider. That one just didn't line up. This time around, Harbaugh, I can tell you this, Dan, has been refreshing his staff list. He's had conversations with people. He's been evaluating the openings. He also, coming off of the greatest feat of his coaching career, winning a national title at his alma mater, his head's in the clouds still a little bit here over the last couple of days. I would anticipate we will find out fairly soon how serious Jim Harbaugh is and whether there's a place that's lined up for him to go in the NFL. It's a lot like I talked about Bill Belichick and how you need to have the personnel and the structure of the organization line up for him to want to take that job. It's a similar type of thing with Jim Harbaugh. Everybody's going to draw the arrows to the LA Chargers. They absolutely are exploring this. And from Harbaugh's perspective, there's a lot to like, and it begins with Justin Herbert. The Chargers also are a family-owned and run business. John Spanos oversees the football operation. Another one of Dean Spanos' sons oversees the business operation. Is that going to be a fit for what they want to do and what Jim Harbaugh wants to do? There's some fascinating discussions to be had if they go down that path. The Raiders makes a lot of sense too. Would Jim Harbaugh and Mark Davis be a fit? We'll see. There's other jobs out there that potentially Harbaugh could be connected to as well. But for me, I would say if Jim Harbaugh is going to take one of these things in this cycle, LA and Las Vegas would be the two to watch.
The Seattle opening. How attractive is that, and who do you think they're going to target?
I believe it's a really attractive job opening in Seattle because they've gotten so much younger. They really flipped that thing over the last few years here. You look at the talent that they've amassed at the skill spots, the young talent that they've amassed on defense. Dan, they went into last season making moves like they thought they could win a Super Bowl right now. They brought back Bobby Wagner and paid him a bunch of money. They made a trade deadline trade for Leonard Williams, which gave up future draft picks. You don't do that if you're not expecting, hey, we're in it to win it right now. They end up 9-8. They missed the playoffs. I think it's fair to say they felt like this was a team that underachieved to a certain degree. 14 years is a long time for anybody to have one job in the NFL. Pete Carroll said it yesterday. He fought. As Pete always says, he competed to be the coach. But Jody Allen, the Seahawks chair, her mind was made up based on the total evaluation here. They're going to look, I think, it's an oversimplification to say, well, Dan Quinn's just going to come in. He's been there before. Dan Quinn's going to have other options. He's a real candidate in Tennessee. He's a real candidate in a place like Washington. He's got slips from a couple of other teams as well. Dan Quinn potentially is going to have options here once we get to the point that Dan Quinn can actually talk with other teams. And so for Seattle, I anticipate you're going to see them put in slips in all likelihood in the coming days here for some of the young offensive coaches, because with Pete Carroll, they've had good offenses at times through the years, but Pete's foundation is defense. Don't turn it over. We're going to win the way that we have to. We have to cut you loose. Russell Wilson, Geno Smith in the fourth quarter. We're going to do that. I think it's going to be somebody who probably fits, in broad swaths, the culture that they've built here. Not that you're going to do everything the same as Pete, which is why it doesn't necessarily have to be Dan Quinn. But I think like that culture of positivity and competition is going to be a big deal for them. They'll run a broad search here, and I'll be interested to see where that lands.
But it feels like Pete still wants to coach. At 72, is he as attractive as Bill Belichick?
I think that if Pete Carroll wants to coach, and he said it in his press conference after the game as well as yesterday, that he doesn't feel worn out. He feels refreshed. He said he's freaking jacked. Again, to use another Pete Carrollism about what comes next here. Absolutely. I mean, there are teams that are going to evaluate this, and I can tell you are evaluating this with Pete. I mean, there's a couple of teams that would make sense. The Atlanta Falcons would make sense. I don't know that Pete is moving across the country to do that at this point, but there's always been an attraction for Arthur Blank to bringing in a guy like a Pete Carroll. I mean, he hired Dan Quinn years ago out of that same program. The Chargers are also a possibility if in terms of at least evaluating this opportunity. Can you imagine Pete Carroll going back to LA to take one more shot, and he's got Justin Herbert at quarterback and a veteran defense? Again, these are all hypotheticals at this point. The Chargers are a team that is going to interview a ton of people for this job. But I would absolutely not rule out Pete Carroll coaching in the NFL again, potentially even in 2024.
All right, I'll leave you with this. I'm trying to understand what the Bears are doing. You keep Matt Eberflus, but you fire the offensive coordinator and the quarterbacks coach, which now leads me to believe they move on from Justin Fields. Why would you take that job if you're an offensive coordinator if you're not even sure if Matt Eberflus is going to be extended? So do the Bears extend their head coach so you get some stability for an offensive coordinator and or quarterbacks coach who's going to go in there? And does that lead you to believe the same thing, that they're going to take somebody number one overall at quarterback?
I don't foresee a contract extension for Matt Eberflus at this point, just because he's 2 years in. Most teams don't do new deals 2 years in unless you've gone to the Super Bowl. The Bears played better the second half of last season down the stretch, and that really made the case for Matt Eberflus to stick around. You look at the numbers on their offense, they weren't horrible. I mean, they ended up number 2 in rushing, even though they didn't even have Justin Fields for a chunk of games. I mean, they're playing with a Division II undrafted quarterback, Tyson Bagent, and they're winning some of those games. They were top 10 most of the season in third downs and red zone. So this was not a completely broken offense by any stretch. I think that my instincts are the same as yours, Dan, which is there's probably a possibility this would signal that you are bringing in a new quarterback and you're going to gear a new offense around him. But the Bears at this point are not going to cut off any of their options in terms of potentially keeping Justin Fields, although he's also at a point where if you're going to commit to him, you'd be thinking about a contract extension for him sooner than later. Bears are in a really unique spot. Ryan Poles said as much yesterday, where you're sitting on the number 1 pick and the number 9 pick, and you have a quarterback who, even though it's never been consistent with Justin Fields, which is the biggest fault there and the biggest reason you might move on, you've also seen him at times do some pretty cool stuff on the field. So a lot of different directions that could go. They immediately put in a request yesterday, Dan, hours after the Pete Carroll decision, for Shane Waldron, who's been the offensive coordinator in Seattle and had Geno Smith playing at a really high level. Is it the most attractive job in the NFL? For all the reasons you just said, there certainly is going to be trepidation among some coaches of, hey, am I walking into a one-year situation and then we're all going to be in trouble here? But whether you're talking about Justin Fields or, just as alluring, probably more so, Caleb Williams, a potential number 1 pick coming in. He hasn't declared for the draft yet. Still could be Drake May. A lot of ways this could go. But let's be honest, Caleb Williams is the one that everybody in the league is going to be talking about, and somebody quite possibly, whether it's the Bears or otherwise, is going to end up in that number 1 spot taking him.
I lied. I have one more. What's the wildest rumor you've heard? Not report. Do you have any wild rumors?
I mean, hasn't reality been more fun than rumor right now, Dan?
That is
Over
true.
the last couple of days, do you need more than Pete Carroll is out in Seattle, Bill Belichick is out in New England? I mean, listen, there's always rumors about what potentially could happen with a Mike Tomlin. He's got 1 year left on his contract. Usually, the Steelers do extensions earlier than that. They didn't in this case. Could he, potentially walk? They'd absolutely be interest with other teams. I think that's something to keep in mind here. I mean, there's so much stuff. We have a coaching. Think about this, Dan. Just like 30,000-foot view this for a second. We have an NFL coaching cycle right now where we're talking about possible candidates: Jim Harbaugh, Mike Vrabel, Bill Belichick, Pete Carroll. That's a real thing that's happening right now in 2024. And when you look at the young candidates for some of these jobs, there's certainly a lot of talented young coaches, but outside of a Ben Johnson, maybe a Brian Callahan, maybe an Aaron Glenn, there's not a whole lot of coaches that you say right now, okay, open and shut, this guy's going to get a job and he's ready to go. It's going to be an absolutely fascinating few weeks in the hiring cycle. And pour on top of that the fact that we've got unique rules now for the first time where you can't do in-person interviews with people who are currently employed by NFL teams until January 22nd after the divisional playoff games. You know who's not subject to those rules? Bill Belichick,
Jim
Mike
Harbaugh.
Vrabel, Jim Harbaugh. Those guys and Pete Carroll. All those guys, it's a different type of a deal because if they end up getting released from their contracts, which is a technical thing we can deal with later, they're available to interview right now, and it'll be fascinating to see where it all goes.
Thank you, Tom.
You got it, Dan. Happy to be here.
Tom Pelissero, NFL Network insider. Man, I'm exhausted after that.